nigh.
You know, when you watch a disaster movie, the scariest part is usually the wide shots. Like you see the tsunami wiping out the coast or a massive earthquake leveling a city.
Right, the sheer scale of the destruction.
Yeah, exactly. It's massive, it's physical, and it is incredibly loud. But then the director suddenly cuts the sound.
Oh, yeah, we know exactly the kind of scene you mean.
Right. The camera pulls away from the collapsing buildings and takes you into this like tiny, quiet, windowless room. The physical destruction outside is gone, and instead you're suddenly watching a psychological thriller.
Yeah, it becomes this targeted interrogation where the terror is just completely human, emotional, and, deeply personal.
It completely shifts the genre of the terror, doesn't it? You go from watching collateral damage on a grand scale to witnessing, well, intentional systemic cruelty.
Absolutely. The fear stops being about the environment and it starts being about what human beings are capable of doing to each other.
And to all of you out there joining us for today's deep dive, welcome, because that cinematic shift from physical destruction to psychological terror is exactly what we were exploring today.
We really are. We've got a massive stack of sources on the table today, too.
Yeah, we have everything from deep historical analyses to intense theological breakdowns of the book of Revelation. And our mission today is to explore a terrifying but really profound story about the end of the world, specifically the breaking of the fifth seal.
It's a heavy topic, for sure.
It really is. We are going to chart a story of growing persecution against Jews and Christians, an event the texts call the abomination of desolation, and the really profound theological meaning behind a group of martyrs crying out from under a heavenly altar.
Right.
So going back to that disaster movie analogy I used, how does that map onto this part of Revelation?
Well, the contrast you just set up is actually the perfect way to look at this text. If you look at the first four seals of Revelation, which most people know as the famous four horsemen of the apocalypse, right?
The guys on the horses.
Exactly. They brought war, famine, plague, and death. It was physical destruction on a global catastrophic scale. But then the fifth seal suddenly pulls back the curtain on heaven to reveal the human and spiritual toll of a global autocratic regime.
Okay, let's unpack this, because a shift in that massive doesn't just happen in a vacuum, right? Like, what is the actual mechanism driving this transition? What happens at this midpoint to plunge the world into this psychological terror?
Well, the breaking of the fifth seal marks a critical juncture in this biblical timeline. It essentially serves as the midpoint of a 7-year apocalypse.
The midpoint.
Yeah, it is the bridge between the initial birth pangs, those first four seals of physical destruction, and the absolutely terrifying second half of this period.
So what triggers the second half?
The sources point to a highly specific trigger event known as the abomination of desolation.
That sounds intense. What exactly is that?
It's not a slow political drift, I can tell you that. It's a sudden, shocking usurpation. This is the moment when the figure known as the Antichrist, who has spent the first half of this period basically consolidating global political power, steps into the temple and literally sets himself up as God.
Wow. So he just demands to be worshipped.
Exactly. He doesn't just want political obedience anymore. He demands absolute, universal worship. And that demand is the exact pivot point where we see early warnings and societal prejudice turn into total, systematic, global persecution.
So it's no longer just an authoritarian government asking for your taxes or your loyalty. The state becomes entirely weaponized against faith.
Right. The state becomes the religion.
And the texts detail this regime, fed by the Antichrist and this propaganda figure known as the false prophet, specifically targeting Jews and Christians who refuse to bow down to this new world order.
Anyone who won't comply is targeted.
Yeah, we're talking about Christianity being outlawed entirely, like Bibles are confiscated and burned, churches are sacked, and the texts even describe public executions becoming a perverse form of public entertainment.
Which is horrifying, but honestly, the physical violence almost feels secondary to the psychological breakdown of society.
Right, because how do you even police the whole world like that?
Well, what's fascinating here is how the regime actually operates to achieve that breakdown. You can't just use brute force to monitor a global population.
No, of course not.
It is simply too expensive and logistically impossible to put a soldier in every single living room. So they use psychological warfare.
How does that work in this context?
The state creates an environment so toxic and so rooted in paranoia that they essentially crowdsource the oppression. The sources describe a scenario where neighbors turn on neighbors.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it gets worse. Even families turn against each other, children ratting out their parents, mothers turning against fathers. The betrayal becomes incredibly intimate.
Which reminds me so much of historical totalitarian regimes, but just, dialed up to a global scale. If you look at how the Stasi operated in East Germany or the KGB in the Soviet Union.
Exactly. Perfect examples.
The state essentially tries to become the ultimate authority, replacing religion entirely. And how do they do it? Paranoia. They didn't need police everywhere because they incentivized betrayal. Families ended up policing themselves.
And think about how that connects to the earlier seals. The third seal brought global famine. Food is scarce.
Oh, right.
So imagine a state that says, hey, if you tell us who in your apartment building is secretly praying or hoarding a Bible, we will guarantee your family's food rations for the month.
That is just deeply chilling.
It is. When you pull the psychological levers of survival and starvation, you pit human nature against human loyalty. You never know who is an informant. You can't even trust your own flesh and blood.
Because under that kind of extreme, sustained pressure, the sources indicate that false Christians just completely defect. Like people who are culturally religious but not deeply convicted, they just abandon their faith just to survive.
Right. They fold under the pressure.
And that leaves only the truly faithful, exposed, isolated, and forced to face the consequences of their defiance.
But when a society reaches that level of absolute state-sponsored paranoia and the violence reaches a fever pitch, the narrative has to address the fallout.
Where do all these victims go?
Well, in Revelation, when the fifth seal is broken, John, the author of the book, he doesn't look at the earthly horror show. The vision pans away to heaven.
Oh, so the camera shifts again.
Exactly. He sees the souls of those who have been slaughtered for the word of God and for their testimony, and he sees them, quote, under the altar.
I have to admit, when I first read that in our sources, I was thoroughly confused. Like, wait, so is there a literal, physical brass altar up in heaven, and thousands of people are just physically trapped underneath it?
It sounds a bit claustrophobic, right?
Yeah, because that sounds less like a holy reward and more like a bizarre celestial hostage situation.
It does sound incredibly strange if you take it completely literally,
Right.
but we have to read this through the lens of apocalyptic symbolism.
Yeah, right, the imagery.
Yeah. To understand what and where this altar is and what it means to be under it, the scholars in our sources look back at the historical blueprints of Moses' tabernacle and the ancient Jewish temple.
Okay, so it's pulling from history.
Exactly. The imagery draws on two specific elements: the golden altar of incense and the altar of burnt offering.
How exactly did those function in the ancient world, though?
Well, in the book of Leviticus, the altar of burnt offering was essentially an industrial center for sacrifice. When an animal was sacrificed, the priests didn't just throw it on a fire.
What did they do?
They took the blood of the sacrifice, which represented the life of the creature, right? And they poured it out at the base, right under the altar.
Oh, I see.
It was a foundation of shed blood. So being, quote, under the altar is a powerful symbolic way of equating their unjust, violent deaths on earth to a holy, consecrated sacrifice in heaven.
That makes so much more sense. It completely reframes the text. Well, what about the word souls? Because again, my modern brain immediately pictures, wispy, see-through spirits floating around in the dark.
Like ghosts.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a very common misconception. In this specific biblical context, soul does not mean a floating, disembodied ghost, which is honestly more of an ancient Greek philosophical idea.
So what does it mean here?
The Greek word used by John, and its Hebrew equivalent back in the Genesis creation account, means the whole living being. Think back to Genesis. God breathed the breath of life into the dust, and man became a living soul.
Right. He didn't just have a soul, he was a soul.
Exactly.
So seeing these, quote, souls slain under the altar, it's not Casper the Friendly Ghost hiding under a bronze table.
Not at all. It is a vivid, highly symbolic courtroom scene. It pictures the reality that these whole human beings, their lives, their identities, their physical bodies, were victimized and unjustly destroyed.
Right.
By placing them under the altar, the text represents the divine response and the sacredness of their sacrifice. It's imagery showing that their shed blood is effectively screaming from the floorboards of heaven.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if their blood is crying out, that highlights a massive shift in the forces at play in this story. Well, in the first four seals, the dominant forces unleashed on the earth were purely physical, Right. Swords, famine, disease.
Mhm.
But the fifth seal suddenly introduces prayer and incense as the dominant force in the narrative. The altar becomes this place of intense intercession.
And this raises an important question about the actual nature of their prayer, because the cry that comes from these martyrs is not, it's not a gentle hymn.
No, it's not.
It is incredibly intense and demanding.
It really is. The text says they cry out with a loud voice. They say, "How long, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, will you refrain from judging and avenging our blood on those who dwell on the earth?"
That's a heavy request.
I have to be honest, reading that feels a bit jarring. It sounds incredibly vindictive, almost petty. It's like they are begging God to be a hitman.
It definitely sounds harsh to modern ears, especially in a culture that values forgiveness above almost everything else.
Right.
But the experts in our sources make a very sharp distinction here. We have to understand the theology of retribution versus revenge.
Retribution versus revenge. What's the difference?
These murders are requesting ultimate justice, not personal revenge. They are not acting out of a petty vendetta because someone insulted them or hurt their feelings. Look at how they start the prayer.
By addressing God as sovereign Lord, holy and true.
Yes, by doing that, they are yielding to divine authority. They are appealing to God's ancient covenant promise found in Deuteronomy 32, where God explicitly states, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay."
I see. So revenge is me hitting you back because you hurt me. But retribution is the state locking you up because you broke the law.
That is a brilliant way to put it.
So they aren't asking for personal payback. They are asking the supreme judge of the universe to hold court and restore a moral order that the Antichrist has completely inverted.
Exactly. God directs divine judgment as righteous retribution. And if we trace the historical timeline of martyrs in the biblical text, this fifth seal represents a profound final shift.
A shift from what?
Think about the first murder in the Bible. Cain kills Abel, and Genesis says Abel's innocent blood cried out from the ground for justice.
Right, the blood crying out again.
Then jump forward to the early Roman persecutions, where Christians were literally thrown to lions. Through all of that, there is a prominent theme of grace. Look at the very first Christian martyr, Stephen.
What do you do?
In the book of Acts, as he was literally being stoned to death by an angry mob, he fell to his knees and prayed for grace. He yelled out, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them."
Which is the ultimate picture of turning the other cheek.
It is.
But the prayer we are looking at in the fifth seal is the exact opposite of Stephen's prayer.
It is the exact opposite. And the reason for that, according to the sources, is that by the time we reach the midpoint of this apocalypse, the era of grace has shifted. The timeline has reached its absolute limit.
So time's up, basically.
Yeah. The time for pardons and turning the other cheek is ending.
Right.
The martyrs aren't asking for the perpetrators to be forgiven. They are issuing a call for ultimate justice against a group the text refers to as the Earth Dwellers.
I noticed that specific phrase popping up constantly in the research. Those who dwell on the earth. At first, I thought it was just a poetic way to say humans.
A lot of people assume that.
Right, but it's not just talking about people who happen to live on a planet with gravity, is it? It's a highly technical term.
It is a very specific technical term in the book of Revelation. It doesn't mean all of humanity. It describes a subset of humanity that is completely, irredeemably hostile to God.
So who are they?
These are people who are totally at home in this corrupt, violent, idolatrous world order. They love the system the Antichrist has built, and they're the ones actively participating in the slaughter of their neighbors.
So what does this all mean for the everyday believers who are actually living through this on Earth? How does a person maintain their testimony, let alone their sanity, under such extreme pressure?
It's almost unimaginable.
Right. Like, your neighbors might turn you in for a loaf of bread, and you might face a public execution. How do you survive that psychologically?
Well, the texts suggest that yielding their desire for personal revenge over to God's supreme authority is exactly how they endure the unendurable.
By letting it go.
Think about it this way. If you believe you live in a random, chaotic universe where your unjust death means absolutely nothing, the psychological weight of that persecution would just crush you.
Yeah, you'd completely despair.
But if you deeply trust that God is a righteous, attentive judge who sees every single ounce of your suffering and who will ultimately perfectly balance the scales, you can surrender your need to retaliate.
Wow, so you can endure the trial because, the final verdict doesn't belong to the corrupt earthly courts of the Antichrist. It belongs to God.
Exactly. You endure it by handing over the gavel.
That is incredibly powerful. But here's the thing that really stopped me in my tracks while reading these sources. When they hand over the gavel and ask, "How long until you judge them?" God's response isn't what you expect at all.
No, it really isn't.
He doesn't immediately strike the earth with lightning. The sky doesn't crack open with immediate vengeance. Instead, God gives each of the martyrs a white robe.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the clothing imagery in the ancient world, and in Revelation specifically, is deeply symbolic of identity, status, and legal standing.
So what does the white robe mean?
The white robe symbolizes justification and purity. It signifies that they have been washed, forgiven, and made clean.
The sources made a point about this robe that just completely blew my mind. Think about how these believers died. When they were killed on earth, they didn't just die quietly. They were likely condemned in a literal court of law by the autocratic regime.
Right, they were tried.
A judge slammed a gavel and labeled them traitors, blasphemers, enemies of the state. They died with a guilty verdict permanently attached to their names.
And that is why the robe is so important. The giving of the white robe acts as a heavenly annulment of those earthly guilty verdicts.
Oh, an annulment.
Yes. The Supreme Court of Heaven is officially overturning the corrupt lower courts of the earth. The robe is God's tangible, symbolic declaration to the universe. The earth called you a traitor, but I call you faithful. You are not guilty. You are innocent, you are pure, and you are entirely victorious.
It's a total exoneration.
Mm-hmm.
So they get the robes, their names are cleared in the cosmic sense, they are validated. But then comes the second part of God's response to their prayer. And this is the hard part.
It is a tough pill to swallow.
He tells them to rest a little while longer until the full number of their fellow servants and brothers, who are to be killed just as they were, is completed.
It is an incredibly difficult answer to process, both emotionally and theologically.
But look, here's where it gets really interesting to me. Well, honestly, a bit jarring when you sit with it. It's a massive paradox.
Very much so.
You have these innocent victims begging for an end to the violence. How long until you stop this? And God's response is essentially, wait, because more of your brothers and sisters must die first. How does someone read that and not immediately see divine negligence? Like, why would a good God delay justice just to let the body count rise?
You've just hit on the ultimate problem of what theologians call theodicy, the defense of God's goodness when terrible things are allowed to happen.
Right, the classic question of why bad things happen.
But the deep theological meaning here is that God's delay is not abandonment, and it certainly isn't negligence. The text is making a bold assertion. The suffering of the martyrs serves a specific vital purpose in God's eternal plan. The delay of justice is actually an act of severe mercy.
Severe mercy. Okay, I need you to break that down. How is delaying justice and allowing more people to be martyred an act of mercy?
Because, according to the theological texts we're analyzing, time is actively being held back to allow for the conversion of the nations.
Wait, conversion? In the middle of all this?
Yes. The end of the age cannot be reached until the totality of God's people is complete, what the text calls the full number. Think about the mechanics of the Antichrist regime we discussed earlier. It relies on total compliance and absolute fear.
Right, the neighbors ratting each other out.
Exactly. When a believer refuses to bow, even at the cost of their own life, it breaks the illusion of the Antichrist's supreme power. The witness of these martyrs is the exact testimony that will awaken others who are still on earth.
So they see someone willing to die for this,
Yeah.
and it wakes them up.
Exactly. Their suffering is not pointless collateral damage. It is the catalyst for gathering the rest of the believers who haven't yet woken up to the truth.
So it completely redefines our human understanding of time and fairness. To us, a delay in justice feels like a denial of justice. If the bad guy isn't punished today, the system has failed.
That's how our human courts work, yeah.
But in this apocalyptic framework, God is operating on a timeline of total global redemption. He is waiting for the exact predetermined number of believers to be brought in. And honestly, it redefines the defeat of evil, too. We usually think evil is defeated by crushing it with a bigger hammer.
Right, overpowering it.
But here, evil is defeated by the radical sacrificial witness of ordinary people who simply refuse to be compromised by it, even if it costs them everything.
That is the absolute core message of the fifth seal. It is not just a historical blueprint, it's an invitation to the believers still living on Earth to endure.
It gives them a reason to keep going.
It tells them that their suffering is an essential, active part of God's plan to conquer evil entirely. The regime's power only endures for a season. The rest that the martyrs are called to in heaven is a confident trust that the sovereign Lord is in absolute control of the timeline, and he will not waste a single drop of their sacrifice.
It really puts into perspective the immense scale of this narrative.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive today.
We really have.
We've traced the harrowing escalation of the Antichrist's regime right at the midpoint of the apocalypse. We've seen how the state gets weaponized, utilizing extreme paranoia and psychological pressure to make families literally turn against each other for survival.
And we've also explored the incredibly poignant imagery of those slaughtered souls, whole human beings whose lives were poured out as a foundation, crying out from beneath the heavenly altar.
Right, and we learned that their plea is not for petty personal revenge, but for the righteous divine restoration of a broken moral order.
Exactly. Retribution, not revenge.
And we unpacked the profound paradox of God's response to that cry. The gift of the white robes, which serve as a heavenly annulment of their earthly convictions, coupled with the incredibly heavy command to rest while history fulfills its painful but necessary purpose.
It is a breathtaking look at the collision between absolute human evil and divine justice.
It really is.
It's a text that ultimately forces the reader to grapple with what they truly value. It asks, where do you place your ultimate trust when the systems of the world, and even your own neighbors, turn completely against you?
Which brings me to a final thought for you to take with you as we wrap up today. Throughout this deep dive, we talked a lot about the earth dwellers. That very specific term used in the sources for people who are completely at home in a corrupt, power-hungry, and violent world.
The ones who adapt to it perfectly.
Yes, they perfectly adapt to the culture around them, no matter how dark or oppressive it gets, just to survive and stay comfortable. If those earth dwellers represent a worldview of total accommodation to a corrupt society, it really makes you wonder about the micro versions of that in our own lives today.
Oh, that's a challenging thought.
How often do you and I comfortably adapt to the culture around us? How often are we completely blind to the quiet, everyday compromises we make with our own moral compass, just so we can fit in, protect our status, and avoid the friction of standing for what is actually true?
It's a very sobering question, because the distance between a small moral compromise today and sitting in that interrogation room you mentioned at the very beginning of the show, well, it might be much shorter than we'd like to think.
It really might be. When the storm finally hits, are we going to stand firm in the quiet room of our convictions, or are we just going to let the hurricane sweep us along with everyone else? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.
9.